The invitation gives a little bit of my activities in my life, but just to give you the highlights, I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio in Cleveland. I went to college in the Chicago area, and I received a degree in piano performance from Northwestern University. Then I studied independent piano in Paris for 2 years and then moved back to the Boston area, and I haven't really left. I had a couple of positions at the Mother Church, worked for the Christian Science Publishing Society in translations, and then moved to the church administrative offices while I was still doing some music for about 10 years. And then I went into the full-time public practice of Christian Science. One other item that might be of interest is I've served for almost 20 years as the Christian Science Chaplain at Harvard. This is a group of some 32 religious professionals who have their own individual constituencies, and we are working together to provide some kind of spiritual, religious, and ethical life for the students and staff at Harvard. I wish that we could all be together in the same room, but I'm so grateful for the Zoom technology that allows us to gather from different places in the country. And I heard there was somebody from Brazil, so maybe I should say the world. One of the accommodations that we need to make for Zoom is that I am speaking to you from my home office in Cambridge. And there are a couple of things that I just need to mention to you that might try to interfere with our time together. For those of you who are privileged to spend their lives with pet companions will understand that I have a cat. His name is Ike. And sometimes he likes to make his presence known by meowing. Actually, I probably should say howling. And so we might see Ike vocalize a little bit at some point during the next 40 minutes or so. Also, right outside my office, I have a back patio where the 8-foot tall fence that separates my property from train tracks. This is the commuter rail train that runs by my house about 10 times a day. And it is possible that sometime in the next 45 minutes or so, we'll hear the commuter rail run by the house. So I apologize in advance for anything that would try to distract us, but I encourage you to stay with me, and we'll have a good time together this afternoon. I'd like to say first that this message has been developed specifically for this audience. I do admit to having shared some of these ideas in different contexts, in different places and circumstances, because these are healing thoughts that I've relied on for years. They're old, familiar friends that have strengthened and supported and inspired me in my growth and my understanding of my relationship to God, the one divine mind, as the healer of all our diseases and of all our diseases. I feel deeply honored to be able to share the next 40 minutes or so with you. Thanks to High Ridge House for inviting me. I am incredibly supportive of all aspects of Christian Science nursing activities, and my gratitude is huge for all the nursing facilities that support and promote pure healing as we understand it in Christian Science. Nurses are the true heroes of our movement. And that conclusion has been solidified in my life through practical experience, and specifically from an incident that I had a few years ago when I was helping to care for a beloved family member while she was a healing in progress. I remember returning from church one Wednesday evening feeling a little overwhelmed with all that I was being called upon to do, as well as the aggressive pictures of decline and feebleness and immobility that were being presented in this case. I was kind of in despair. wondering what more I needed to be bringing to my responsibilities in order to be the best help that I could be. There were some wonderful visiting Christian Science nurses helping out periodically, but I had most of the duty in the overnight hours. We were all praying and listening for divine love's care and guidance as we made decisions to set up the best care situation, while this dear one was so desirous of remaining in her own home. It was a pretty challenging time. So when I got back from church that night, I just felt determined that I wasn't going to go to sleep until I felt more inspired and uplifted, until I felt able to bring my A game to the circumstances. As I listened in the closet of prayer, the phrase, "He came where he was," unfolded to my thought. I recognized it right away as the part in Jesus' parable in the New Testament when the Good Samaritan shows compassion for the man who was beaten up and left to die on the side of the road. So I opened my Bible and I refreshed my thought with the specific steps outlined in the Samaritan's tender ministerings. I began to prayerfully ponder the significance of each action that he took, and I applied it to my situation. Each step of the parable seemed to provide direction for me as I clearly saw how divine love's care was manifested in every detail of the story, and then how it could be seen as evidence of God's watchful caring for me, as well as for the nurses and this dear family member at the challenging time. I was confident that the Comforter could lift us all above fear and concern and provide the guidance and the counsel that we all needed. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of the ideas that came to me in my prayers that evening. First, the Samaritan came where he was. To me, that seemed to represent the ingenuity of God, divine love, the infinite giver of all good, to express himself right where the need was, to lift that sense of burden, to enable me and everyone supporting the circumstances to freely express the patience, tenderness, and understanding that was so necessary in this fear-producing and hope-challenged time. Those qualities of patience and tenderness were nursing qualities. And even though I wasn't a trained nurse, I knew that I could join with those visiting nurses in order to help support the needs at the time. Next, the Samaritan showed compassion for the victim of the mugging by binding up his wounds. I could see that that step was more than just what needed to be done practically, but to bind up the brokenhearted, to reflect and express divine love's healing oil right in the midst of the atmosphere of hopelessness and discouragement. The need seemed to me to also involve healing the mental wounds of feeling panicky, vulnerable, frustrated with the limitations of the circumstances, as well as to express the spiritual attitude and altitude of thought that would help lift thought above the fear. Well, then the Samaritan poured in oil and wine. I saw these as symbols of prayer, consecrated thought, and inspiration, which we all yearned to see outwardly expressed right when and right where it was needed. The oil and wine was an outward manifestation of divine love's caring, and I yearned to be a transparency for that kind of expression. Then the Samaritan loaded the injured man onto his own beast and led him away from the place of attack, away from the fear and violence, to the inn. I loved the selflessness of that act. Putting the injured man on his donkey meant that he himself was walking beside as they made their way out of that place of trauma to a place of safety. Here I began to see how important it was for me to be removed in thought from the mental atmosphere of vulnerability to fear and harm. And I knew it would help me remove that same feeling of vulnerability in this dear family member. taking the patient to the inn seemed like a great metaphor for embracing the whole situation in the atmosphere of the kingdom of heaven, that reign of harmony where soul, spiritual sense is supreme. And the Samaritan even provided money, more practical resources for further care should it be needed. Well, that's just a little window into the inspiration that unfolded to me that evening, and how it really helped me master the fear that was getting in the way of my best efforts to support the situation at an urgent time. Very shortly after this turning point, we were able to transition this dear family member to a private duty nursing situation where a faithful Christian Science nurse could be present to meet the needs on a 24-hour basis. It was exactly what was needed at the time. Whenever I recall that experience, I send up a prayer of deep gratitude for all our Christian Science nurses and the sweet, consecrated Samaritan example they exhibit, as well as for facilities like High Ridge House that are the outward manifestation of the inn that is so necessary for maintaining a healing environment for those in need. Some of you may have heard the old story about a ship that was sunk in the South Atlantic during World War II. The survivors were floating around in lifeboats, and they'd exhausted their scant provisions pretty quickly. Just when they were beginning to lose all hope, and they were afraid the end was near, a rescue ship appeared and got them all on board. Then the captain of the rescue ship pulled one of the survivors aside, and he said, "We're so grateful that we came along when we did and that you're all okay, but we don't understand why you're all so dehydrated." And the survivor said to him, "Well, are you crazy? We ran out of drinking water several days ago." Then the captain just smiled and said, "Don't you know where you are? You're in the place where the Amazon River empties millions of gallons of fresh water into the sea. You've been floating in an ocean of fresh water. Don't you know where you are?" It's a great question. We can be right in the very presence of what we most need and not realize where we really are. And I think one of the main reasons we somehow just don't get it is because we forget to hold on to the truth of what we know, the spiritual reality of God's presence and power equal to every need. And one of the major obstacles keeping us from realizing that the solution to our challenges in healing is just at hand is fear. Fear that we're in a situation where God can't help us, or that we don't know what to do, or that it won't work out in the right way. Fear that we just can't feel God's loving care right when we most need it. And what kind of challenges are we talking about? I think everyone has something that needs healing, whether it's individual health challenges, family discord, human relationship issues, church inharmony, political turmoil, global pandemic. Each set of circumstances will benefit greatly from our demonstrating more mastery over fear. Those of us who are deep students of Christian Science are very familiar with the guidance that we find in both the Bible as well as Mary Baker Eddy's writings, which are uniquely designed to help us overcome those many phases of fear, from minor anxieties to raw panic and everything in between. Let me just touch on a few things from Mary Baker Eddy's writings, which reveal some pretty blunt and strong statements about fear. They help us to expose the impossibility that fear could ever overwhelm God's power to keep us safe from panic or harm. We read that fear is an element of all disease. Mrs. Eddy writes, "Disease is fear made manifest on the body." that it's a self-constituted falsity, that when fear disappears, the foundation of disease is gone, that if we succeed in wholly removing the fear, the disease disappears. And finally, fear, which is an element of all disease, must be cast out to readjust the balance for God. We all need to do this. We need to readjust the balance in our thinking for God and his presence and power. Many of us have probably heard the popular acronym for fear, FEAR, false evidence appearing real. That's a good way to help get a handle on fear. Think of it as false evidence. Considering fear as false evidence compels us to know what really is true and to challenge how things appear to be. For example, we're not afraid to get on a train just because we look down the tracks and we see that they seem to come together at the distance. We know that's an optical illusion, and that knowledge keeps us from being deceived. Or if we see a pool of water on the highway as we're driving along, we're not going to pull over to the side of the road, grab a towel, and go wipe up the water. We know it's not there. It's just the way the light reflects on the pavement. And it sure seems like the earth is flat when we just look out to the horizon, doesn't it? But looking right through the physical evidence can help us gain the real truth. There's another acronym that I've been using lately to challenge fear in my life: forgetting everything about reality. When we deal with fear, the fear of failure or disease, fear of violence in our schools, or of losing something dear to us, it's always good to ask ourselves, what's really going on? What's the reality? So now I'd like to get into talking about some biblical models for prayer in dealing with fear-producing situations. As students of the Bible, we can find a wealth of resources in learning what the spiritual reality really is. And I found that my appreciation of Bible verses and narratives increases tenfold when I study them, not only for the biblical record, what happened and why, but also from the standpoint of what these accounts indicate about qualities of thought that I can either accept or reject as my own consciousness and experience, mental qualities that I want to express, as well as those that I want to refuse to agree with. And when I'm digging for more spiritual insight into familiar stories in the scriptures, I know there's no right or wrong way to do it. There's just my own spiritual intuitions, just me listening to divine intelligence to show me the way. So I'd like to share some examples of how I do this in applying these ideas to overcoming fear, that temptation to forget about reality as God is revealing it to us, right where the fear might feel so aggressive. So first, from the Old Testament, David and Goliath. We all know the story. Huge giant, small shepherd boy, lots of fear all around, mostly by the armies of Israel, who were bamboozled by this giant blowhard calling out for just one of the Israelites to come down on the plain to settle the battle one-on-one. But I'd like to focus on one snippet of this story. The part when David rejected using King Saul's armor for the battle and chose instead to go looking for 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook. If we look at this scene for what it can teach us about how we should handle ourselves in times of fear and stress, we could ask, well, what was David thinking when he knelt down to pick up those stones? He probably had to do a little searching for the smoothest ones. What was going on in his thought as he did that? Well, whenever I think about the number 5, I think about the 5 material senses. If we just didn't have to deal with all the information coming at us through what we see, hear, feel, taste, and smell through the physical senses, our fear and panic wouldn't seem so baffling sometimes. It can be so mesmerizing to deal with material sense testimony. But what about our spiritual senses? We all have them. And they're the exact opposite of physical sense. The book of Hebrews says that we should have our senses exercised to discern between good and evil. So that's what we're going to do right now. As we consider this story, we're going to exercise our spiritual senses. I like to think that perhaps during those moments of searching the brook for his stones, David was praying and affirming what his spiritual senses were revealing to him about what he was about to face. I can imagine him picking up that first stone and listening to God tell him what he really needed to be seeing. Not a huge giant able to crush him and defeat the armies of Israel, but he was disciplining his thought to see or discern the power of God present, just like when God saved him from the lion and bear while he was shepherding his sheep. I like to think he was affirming his ability to see God's presence and power manifested to prevail over the aggressive picture of a domineering giant. Moving on to another sense, and the second stone, David might have been pondering the need to listen, to turn a deaf ear to Goliath's boasting of his superiority and his threats to annihilate the Israelites. He probably knew how important it was to give a listening ear to what God the Lord was speaking to his heart, emboldening him with love, courage, and expectation. David knew that because he was coming in the name of the Lord, he could hear God speaking peace to his heart, and his victory was assured. Okay, now the third stone, pointing to one more sense that he could lift up. How about what David was feeling during those moments? I like to think of the feeling sense as spiritual consciousness. And picking up that third stone, David might have been feeling the power of his prayer to quiet his excited heart with thoughts of peace in his soul, a sense of God's love for him transcending any anxiety or concern over the outcome. David was so conscious of his deep intimacy with God, whose presence and power he so beautifully recorded in Psalm 139. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. David knew so clearly that even in the throes of battle, even there, God's hand would lead him and hold him and lead him to victory. Moving on to the fourth stone and another one of the senses. I'm going to have a little fun with this one, okay? I like to think of the spiritual sense of taste as a relish for the truth. Sorry for the pun, a relish for the truth. What I mean by that is a deep enjoyment that comes from pondering and dwelling in the presence of all that is real, from feeling the influence of divine truth, acting with the power of the infinite to reveal its presence and pure reality. So instead of experiencing the physical sense of fear attempting to cause symptoms like rapid breathing or dry mouth resulting from panic at the prospect of meeting this giant, David might have been recalling a thought from another one of his Psalms. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. And what about that fifth sense, our sense of smell? Spiritually speaking, I like to think of the sense of smell as spiritual intuition or memory. It's like what happens sometimes when I enter a room and become conscious of a scent or an aroma of something that's so familiar to me that it reminds me of someone or some place long forgotten. That sense of smell is sometimes the first thing that makes an impression on our thought. It's an intuition of something. So maybe in that search for that fifth stone, David was having an opportunity to be strengthened by recalling all the blessings that he'd received at God's hand. It was an occasion for drawing from his memory bank all the various ways that God had protected him through the years as he was keeping watch over his flocks of sheep. Now, this is just my own approach to this part of the Bible story. You may have many other ways to interpret it. And as I said before, I don't think there's really a right or a wrong way to find models for prayer in these priceless scriptural accounts. David only needed one stone to fell that giant with his sling, didn't he? The account doesn't really tell us what David was thinking or feeling. But I like to consider that the process of choosing 5 smooth stones gave him the prayer time to instinctively protest against the power of the physical senses to impress him with their false pictures, and then to feel the power of God defending him, giving him a sense of God's reality and preparing him for the victory. Well, back to that question to the survivor at the sea. Don't you know where you are? I like to think David's exercise of prayerful preparation, stepping through the waters of that brook, finding those smooth stones, reaffirmed for him exactly where he was. In God's care, never outside of his presence, guidance, or influence. And it enabled him to go forth to the battle and be victorious. Okay, everybody still with me? Because we're going to turn to another Bible verse that I found to be a great solution for fear. It's that familiar verse from Isaiah 41, verse 10. And it was actually in the golden text from the Christian Science weekly Bible lesson last week. Isaiah is encouraging us with guidance that God has revealed to him. He quotes our supreme creator as saying, "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." To me, that's like God prompting us. Don't you know where you are? I'm with you. I'm your God. Look at what I'm doing from you. I'm strengthening you and upholding you. A few years ago, I traveled to the Midwest to spend the Christmas holiday with my family. It had been a very busy few weeks before I made the trip, and I arrived feeling very tired and with serious symptoms of what I probably felt was the flu. I didn't diagnose it, but it sure felt like it. Although my family was very sympathetic and loving, there was still so much that they relied on me to accomplish: shopping, errands, preparing a big Christmas dinner with all the fixings. And I was feeling so overwhelmed by the physical symptoms and so unable to measure up to what was being expected of me. I was definitely not experiencing the happy occasion that Christmas holiday usually means. I was so far from cherishing the dawning of the Savior Christ in my consciousness at that particular moment. So I knew I needed to double down on my prayerful efforts to see through the nothingness of anything that would try to interfere with what I knew I needed to do. But I was so afraid that I just couldn't transcend the way I was feeling in order to fully engage in the holiday spirit. So I turned to this verse from Isaiah and began to see it prayerfully as a 3-step recipe for mastering what I knew was the foundation of this discord, these physical symptoms, my fear that I wouldn't be able to do what I was supposed to do, as well as my concern that these symptoms were just going to hang on throughout the holiday and I wouldn't be very good company. Isaiah first records, "Fear thou not, for I am with thee." I saw that with these words, God was teaching me that there was a direct connection between his presence with me and my ability not to be afraid. Just as the 23rd Psalm reassures us, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Then I reasoned that the next part of that verse from Isaiah reaffirmed my relationship with God. "Be not dismayed, for I am thy God." That to me meant I am God's and God is mine. It reaffirmed my inseparable relationship with my Creator. It was like God saying to me, "You're mine, and I've got this." The third step in this recipe was very clear to me. God was encouraging me with a declaration of what he was doing for me. "I will strengthen thee. I will help thee. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." Righteousness to me means right thinking and right acting. So I held to these truths throughout those few days when I was running around with those Christmas preparations. Every time I was tempted to get ahead of myself and wonder if I was going to be free of these symptoms in time to support the activities and enjoy them myself, I went back to that 3-step recipe and affirmed God's presence and my inviolable relationship to him, and also my conscious awareness of what he was doing for me right at the moment if I was feeling fearful or apprehensive. Gratefully, I improved significantly with each hour that passed, and by the time Christmas Day rolled around, I was on my feet a good part of the day in the kitchen, preparing and serving the meal with joy and freedom. I'm so grateful for that simple guidance that got me through a challenging time. And you know, that's not the only time I've relied on those simple yet profound truths from Isaiah 41. But this time it was just what I needed to rise above the sense that healing needed to be a process of just gradually feeling better and better. I saw the experience as more of an awakening to God's presence and power right there in the now, helping me defend myself from falling into the pit of fear that might have paralyzed me and prevented me from being there for my family. Okay, let's change scenes again to another Bible narrative, this time from the New Testament, the Master Christian and his disciples. They're out on a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and all of a sudden a storm breaks out. If you don't mind, I'm going to indulge a little license here and put myself in the boat with the disciples and experience it with them. The wind is starting to blow with raw force. I, along with the disciples, we're probably feeling the wind whipping against our cheeks. The waves are rising higher and higher, washing over the edge of the boat. It's beginning to rain and to rain hard. Each drop of water is feeling like pinpricks against our faces. I'm sure that we're hanging on for dear life with one hand and using the other hand to bail some of the water out of the boat. We're all kind of freaking out. And with each sway of the boat, we're sure it's going to flip over completely, and we'll find ourselves flailing about in the water. Now, where's Jesus during all of this? Well, our skipper, he's one cool customer. He's not worried at all. As a matter of fact, he's so unimpressed by what's going on around him he's decided to take a little nap. So the disciples go back to him and find him in the back of the boat, asleep on a pillow. They wake him up, saying, in essence, "Don't you care that we're sinking here?" Now I'm trying to visualize the look on Jesus' face at this point. Maybe there's just a hint of disappointment in his eyes because of our obvious lack of faith. As he gets up and he speaks commandingly to the wind and wave, "Peace, be still." And as quickly as the storm blew up, we find ourselves in the midst of the sweetest calm and peace that we've ever known. No more fear. All from that one divine command: peace, be still. Okay, so what was the real reality in this scene? The disciples were all in the same boat. Jesus too. They were in the same sea, the same wind and rain. Yet we see pictured in this beautiful story two different responses to the same exact circumstances. On the one hand, the disciples were so panicked, they thought they were going to go down with the ship. Jesus felt such a sense of safety, he was able to fall asleep. Here's the great part. When the disciples found him in the back of the boat, Jesus didn't wake up to their sense of panic and terror. He actually ended up waking them up to his sense of peace and calm. And not only that, his quieting sense was outwardly manifested in a calming of the storm, in a total mastering of the effects of the raging elements of the sea. I remember reading a Bible commentator's remark that Jesus was called the Master partly because nothing ever mastered him. The Gospel of John records these words of Jesus spoken during his farewell discourse to the disciples. "Don't you believe that I am one with the Father, and that the Father is one with me? What I say isn't said on my own. The Father who lives in me does these things." Jesus' example embodied such oneness with his Father that we, as his followers, have every right to hear and respond to those words, "Peace, be still," just as if the divine voice is speaking directly to our thought. And we know that voice as the Christ, God's spiritual nature, revealing itself to us in just the way we need to know it. We're all so grateful for those Bible-based terms for God that we love and use daily in our prayers. Just like a prism that reveals the rainbow colors contained in the sun's light, these synonyms, these names for God, show forth different facets of the divine nature in ever-deepening ways. So we can see Jesus' words in stilling the storm as an example of how the Christ, that divine nature from God, divine truth, speaks to our thought, "Peace, be still." The divine manifestation of truth is the active presence of all that is real. And its "peace, be still" to our thought and circumstances helps neutralize the fear we feel when we learn of another terrorist incident or someone dear to us getting a serious diagnosis, or even a new variant cropping up in a global pandemic. We can also hold on to the Christ manifestation of God as divine love, the universal solvent dissolving our fears, reassuring us, "Peace, be still," in the face of sorrow, loss, or economic troubles. We can hear the divine life that is God, encouraging us, "Peace, be still," silencing the clamor of the physical senses with life's own presence of harmonious action, expressing itself as the divine self-existence of all good, tenderly embracing all creation as its own. The Christ, the divine manifestation of mind, is tenderly encouraging us, peace, be still, to fears of confusion or memory loss, or storms of division and lack of mutual understanding in community or church meetings. And the divine manifestation of soul is comforting us with peace, be still, to show forth its government of the harmonious functioning of our bodies with fearlessness and dominion. Peace, be still. It's a wonderful rebuke to fear, as well as a powerful encouragement to defend our spiritual consciousness, to withstand fear's attempts at convincing us that we can ever be in a situation where God cannot help us. So, the next time you're facing a circumstance where fear seems to be trying to rule your thought, it might bring you some fresh inspiration to think about these biblical models for prayer. Ponder those 5 stones. Know that you're in God's loving atmosphere. Claim the presence of your spiritual senses, asserting themselves to offset the temptation to forget everything about reality. Know where you really are, in God's presence, under his control. Affirm your ability to understand and feel God's presence right in the midst of fearful circumstances. And don't forget that 3-step recipe recorded in Isaiah 41. Remind yourself of why you can't be separate from your Father, Mother, God, who is constantly ratifying his relationship to you, his beloved child, and who is strengthening you right now to take your stand against fear's impositions. Or you might find the circumstances you're experiencing are just the perfect opportunity to demand of yourself whether you want to be like the disciples and freak out at this particular storm of concern or panic, or whether you want to be more like the Christ and listen to God's divine messages speaking peace to your heart, knowing that there can never be any separation between the spiritual facts that we know and embody and their outward expression in our experience. Don't we know where we are? Yes, we do. We know that our spiritual senses are asserting themselves right now to help us see, feel, and hear God's voice of assurance and protection. We know that God is constantly reminding us of what he is and what he does for us, upholding us with courage to claim our ability to think and act rightly. And we can be certain that knowing the power of God's word as revealed through biblical models for prayer can and will transform our storms of fear and panic into the still, small voice of calm, flowing into every nook and cranny of consciousness and experience, and revealing our fearlessness and our mastery over any untoward circumstance. Thank you, everyone, for your attention this afternoon, and I'm wishing you a blessed Christmas, every one of you.
Thank you, Margit, for those beautifully inspiring words, and Merry Christmas to you all. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much from Germany.